So we begin with the question, can history be used for peace? And, some people would say, that's not a question. Of course it can be used for peace. Everything can be used for peace. But I would like to say that, in fact, we have to take particular notice of how history can be used for peace. Of course, I agree. It not only can be used, it has to be used. I mean, one of the purposes of history is that it's used in different situations. And history for peace is certainly something which is extremely important and should be discussed as much as possible. So we begin with the question that how does the past affect the present? Keeping in mind the fact that history always has a link with the past and the present. I think it was E.H. Carr or someone who said that the really good historian is the one who is dealing with the past, but is looking over his shoulder at the present and keeping that connection between the past and the present valid whilst he's talking about the past. I mean, you may think this is a bit of a contradiction, but I don't think so, in the sense that I think that there's a lot of interconnection between the two. I mean, some of us would argue that there would be no present without a past. Anyway, so that's there. We're learning lessons from the past. And so we begin with, what are the central topics that we currently observe from the past? The normal things, yes, like, how do they live? How do they eat? What do they dress? What do they do? How do they conduct themselves? So on. But there are other issues which are very important to the functioning of society, which we also have to keep in mind. And that is three things I would underline. In terms of just functioning, not so much in terms of what kind of society it was. It was obviously a kind of society that was different, but just in terms of functioning. I would say power, the concept of power, and the way in which it is used, deployed, displayed, etc. Victory, the sense of you're doing things and you're doing actions that will result in a victorious end to what you are doing. And the third very important aspect of functioning is, of course, administration. What are you administering? Who are you administering to? And what is your administration all about? Power is fairly simple. Who ruled? Families, lineages, dynasties. And how do you define power? Most people would say, by what is controlled. Yes, that's a very obvious definition. How does it enable you to control society? But there are other aspects too, which are aspects that have to do with what are the agencies of power? Is it all just controlled through being king or through administration? Or are there other more subtle agencies? For example, culture. Does culture have an aspect of power which it uses to, if not control, to direct society in particular ways? And I would say that it very much has that aspect and uses it. Victory, again, when we say victory, we always think of invaders and conquerors and victorious terminations to battles. But there are other kinds of victories as well. Debate. Who comes through as the person who really is the more important person in the debate? That is a kind of victory. Arguments of any kind, which you may win or lose. If you win them, you regard yourself as victorious. And administration refers not only to the way in which society is functioning, but also to the way in which these different aspects of power are interrelated and hold out over a society. So really one's talking about a fairly complex situation. And I would like you to keep that in mind. It's not a simple situation in any of these terms. We investigate other aspects of life as historians. We may not bring them into textbooks. Textbooks are very limited after all. But we look at things like the economy and the environment. How does the environment affect the economy, and how does the economy affect the environment? And then you come across some really startling bits of evidence that areas that today were desert areas were not deserts in ancient times. They were very fertile areas. And you begin to say, well, what happened? And that's a very good question in terms of the environment. What happened to make the environment what it is today? It was not something that remained the same for millennia, for years that went on and on for centuries. It did change. Many deserts were once green that are now deserts. And it's a very fundamental question for the historian to ask as to why this change took place. And then we have patterns of living. Why do they vary? What do I mean by patterns of living? The difference, for example, between the simplest, elementary, what we call primitive patterns of living, hunters and gatherers, the evidence for which we have from archaeology, people who hunted and gathered. And what does one mean by that? Hunting is fairly simple. They were hunting animals that they could eat. Gathering was going out into the forests, into the jungles, and picking up the produce, the natural produce of things that were growing, which were also edible and could be used. So you have a category of culture that is called hunters and gatherers, a very simple category. Then you have a category called pastoralists. These are people who herded animals. That is, there were some animals that were thought to be useful if they were domesticated, beginning perhaps with goats and sheep and animals like that, and then coming on to cattle and bigger animals of that kind, horses, which were not used for dairy produce so much as they were used for actually organizing living and defense and so on. So pastoralists are again important. Why do pastoral lands change character? Fertile pastures very often become infertile acreages where nothing grows. Again, one has to ask the question of what happened to the environment. And then you have cultivators. They learn how to cultivate a crop which they grow, which they live on. And the crop varies. It can be barley in one place, yava. It can be rice in another, vrihi. It can be wheat in another, gehu, and so on. And there are different kinds of environments that go in for the produce of these different kinds of crops. And at a more advanced, complicated level of society, you begin to have craftsmen. Who were the craftsmen? The earliest were probably the potters, who simply made handmade vessels, which they fired and used for storing and eating and so on. And then gradually you move on to when the wheel is invented, they adopt the wheel to the making of pottery, and pottery is then wheel thrown, and you begin to have many more sophisticated forms of pottery. Craftsmen are, of course, of many kinds. You have not only the pottery makers, you have textile makers, people who weave thread and then convert it into into textiles. Or you have metalware. Metalware is again a very important object material with which objects can be made, mechanical objects, for example. And then you have construction workers who actually make bricks and build buildings out of the bricks. So they make brick, they cut stone, and they make buildings out of the stone. And ultimately, you begin to get traders and urbanites, people who exchange goods. Exchange is originally good for good. I am producing, let's say, I'm growing wheat and I need clothing, textiles. So I exchange wheat for textiles, which is called barter. And then gradually you have the more sophisticated form, which is that there's a unit that controls exchange, and that unit is money. So I pay money for my wheat, and the other person pays money for his textiles. And so money becomes the unit of the economy. What I'm trying to stress here in all of this is that there is no such thing as, this is how it all began and it continued in the same way. There is a very slow evolution of change, and the change is based on the function of the object, the material out of which it is made, and the ultimate use and to which it is put. And on this, once this material life has been worked out and one is living that material life, there comes the next stage, which is that of society and classification. How do you divide society into groups, into functional groups, which, for example, we call caste? And the basic question is that, was the earliest Indian society determined by caste? Obviously not. Caste is something that comes a little later. But there are typologies of people doing different jobs and doing different things. It's not accidental. It is something that evolves from one stage to another, from one change to another. I mean, the example that always intrigues me is that if you take religion, which is the next stage after the social typology of societies, then you start thinking of their belief systems and their rituals and what is it that explains why they believe in mother goddesses and why they believe in the power of the tiger and that kind of thing. And what is it that leads to the rituals that are connected with these beliefs? The rituals have a very important social function apart from having a religious function. And the historian really has to know about this. I'm always very intrigued by, for example, in the same religion, in Hinduism, you begin with the Vedic texts, and they are performing sacrificial rituals. Huge altars are built, and prayers are carried out, and hymns are sung, and rituals are carried out around these altars. They are simple altars, nothing else, brick-built altars to specific measurements, which become the focus of the ritual. And yet, 1,000 years later, very few people are praying at these altars or building these altars. A few are, but very few. What has happened? You've got temples and you've got icons. So they're praying to the icon of the deity, and the icon of the deity is placed in a temple. This comes rather late, in the early centuries AD. And one has to ask the question, why did this develop out of a society that didn't have it before? What led to the idea of having these permanent places of worship and representing deities in icons? This is a tough question, but it's a question that has very interesting answers of various dimensions. And you then also get, once you start getting religious ideas and rituals and explanations, after all, what is fundamentally religion is an explanation of how human beings come into existence, what they're there for, what they're praying for, what they want from life, etc., what they fear about death, and so on. In this process of thinking about it, you begin to get some people who say, we think it happened this way, and other people who say, no, 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 it happened in another way. And this is called dissent. You begin to have people who say, this is how it happened, and other people who say, no, this is not how it happened in another way. And this adds to the interests that develop in a society where you have a little debate and argument about how things happened. Now, this is one way of approaching your material and considering it as you would in terms of what are we looking at in history, what are the aspects that we're giving attention to. And keeping this always in mind, what of these are aspects that are conducive to peace? What I've been talking about as the evolution of culture from one kind of society to another is something we have to understand and explain if we're going to be talking about peaceful movements in history. It's not all violence and killing and the triumph of putting people to death. That's not it. That's only one aspect of life. There are many, many other aspects. And I'm really trying and underline the other aspects. All these then are seen as what we call patterns of culture, patterns of living, patterns of culture. And understanding patterns of culture is very fundamental to understanding history, especially early history. Culture itself has changed its meaning since the 19th century. In the 19th century, if someone talked about a culture or they talked about you as being cultured, it meant that you were familiar with the kinds of things in society that the elite groups appreciated, the upper caste groups appreciated. Literature, complex, complicated, exquisite Sanskritic literature was one, which was not open to everybody. It was only open to those that could afford it and could have the time and energy to spend on learning the language. Its literature used to be a very time-consuming, energy-consuming occupation. It's becoming less so that these days. Art, architecture, this was all part of culture. This was part of living it up in a very elite way. And going on with that, of course, was philosophy and the more esoteric religious ideas. And religion always is something that caters to different levels of society. At the lowest level, you have people who simply worship an object. This is religion for them. And they have the rituals of worship. At a higher level, you have people worshiping multiple gods or multiple objects. And the rituals connected become more complicated. At a still higher level, you have people debating ideas of religion and worship and ritual. That's quite abstract. I mean, the Upanishads, for example, you can't put your finger on them. They're abstract ideas. And this was the peak kind of form of worship and ritual in the Vedic period. So there's all of this going on in a society and must go on in any kind of society, wherever you go, however simple it may be, however complicated it may be. This is the kind of thing that is being talked about, discussed, and so on. But there's one other thing that I think is important, especially if one is looking at what else can we learn from history other than just invasions and conquests and victories and so on, which is the kind of thing we normally do. So if we're looking for ideas of peace from history, what else do we look at? Then we play what I call the what if game. What if something was different? What if, for example, Mahmud of Ghazni had not raided the Somnath temple? Imagine a situation where you have this temple, and this temple is a hub of religion and worship and trade and exchange and so on. Mahmud of Ghazni doesn't actually come. So what does one do? What is one worshipping? What is one doing? That is what I call the what if game. And it does lead you to think about possible alternatives, which are fun to do. I mean, I'm not suggesting this as a serious historical exercise, because that'll get you into great trouble and it'll get you zeros in what you write. But simply as a game, as a challenge, imagine something that you're very familiar with and say if that hadn't happened, what would society have been like? What would have happened? It's a fun thing to do. No battles, for example. Can you imagine a society that didn't fight battles? That kings didn't go out and conquer territory? Could happen. But what would be the alternative? You have to think about it. And the consequences of this kind of what if thinking is that you have to reach out to many, many sources. Because if Mahmud of Ghazni did not attack the Somnath temple, but the Somnath temple fell into disrepair, how did it happen? What happened? This is not because of conquest, but it is simply because of wear and tear, time. People are not maintaining the temple. Why are they not maintaining the temple? What happened? So there are infinite possibilities that you could think of. And actually, it's quite a fun game if you try doing it. It's not quite as wild as it sounds. Okay, so let's get back to the evolution of society, which is fundamental to the idea of what is the alternate way in which we can think about history other than simply conquests, invasions, victories, major rulers making conquests. Society comes into existence with your hunter-gatherers and your pastoralists and so on, and it slowly grows and evolves and changes. It's one thing that has changed enormously over time. Society has constantly been changing. What the historians are desperately trying to do is keep up with the changes and ask themselves, how do we record these changes and how do we make sense of them? So we go back to our little line of hunter-gatherers in prehistoric India. The Narmada Valley is full of hunter-gatherers. They're making little paintings in every cave and every rock shelter they find. They're paintings of hunting, and they're paintings of deities, and they're paintings of worship. In their own kind of way, they're making these paintings. We first thought that there was only one site that had these paintings, Bhimbetka. Now we know there are hundreds of sites. So there were a lot of these people running around with paint and brush and making these paintings, which is a nice thought. Hunter-gatherers, they're growing, hunting animals, and there's a slow change to cultivation. Societies then start growing their own food, cereals and vegetables. And at first, it's shifting agriculture. You cultivate one area, and after 10 or 12 years, when it goes dry, you move to another area and you cultivate that. You leave the first area uncultivated so that it recovers a bit of its health, and then you can go back to it, or you can move on. And at the same time as you had cultivation, you had the domestication of animals. Now, people didn't have to go out and hunt for animals to get their meat, which they were avid eaters of, but they domesticated the animals. So they had dairy produce and meat. They had two things to eat, which was worthwhile. And when they had all this, when you start beginning to get more of something, more of food, you're living more comfortably, what do? You start playing around with things, making objects and that kind of stuff. So you play around and you start making pots, and pots are very useful for storing things. Pots also become very useful as exchange with people who may not be having pots, and they suddenly realize, what a good idea, I can keep my food in a pot and not keep it on the floor somewhere in a heap. So pottery begins to be used, made, developed, evolves, becomes more and more functional and more aesthetically beautiful. Some of the early pottery is really aesthetically very lovely. Once you begin to produce goods of different kinds, irrespective of what they are, and exchanging them, exchange is a very crucial activity because it leads you to trade. So exchange is there, and you either have what is called barter, where I take a pot of rice and you give me a piece of cloth. It's a direct exchange, it's barter. You calculate that my pot of rice is about the same value as your piece of cloth, and so it's exchanged. And then slowly and gradually you switch to what I said earlier, which is a unit of value. It may not be money to begin with, it may be an object to begin with, but then gradually it becomes money. Money is abstract. Money has no purpose, no function of a functional kind. You can't use it in cooking, you can't use it in hunting and that kind of thing. Money has its own untouched, unalloyed function, which is as a unit of value, and therefore is very important. And this coincides then with another development that's taking place, which is that people who are in power, in control, begin to control all of this. They control, first of all, the production of goods, then they control the exchange of goods, then they control the money, which is the unit of value. And once they start controlling the money, they become rich merchants and traders. That's when wealth becomes a really important issue in society. Now, it's not a late development, it goes pretty far back. And it's very interesting as to what societies do with money. For example, all the excavations that are going on currently in Kerala and Tamil Nadu of the trade between the South Indian producers of pepper and textiles and so on, and ivory, and traders coming in from the Eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea. The traders come with money, and the money is kept by the South Indian traders in huge jars. It's hoarded. And the question that historians often ask is, why did they hoard the money? How come they didn't use it? They didn't use it as bullion. It's gold and silver coins. They hoarded them. Sometimes they made jewelry out of them. Sometimes they just kept them. But the use that you make of something economically important is a very important consideration in history. Now, once you begin to get people who are wealthy and powerful and control society, they're not satisfied with just their wealth and their power. They wanted recorded that they are the ones who are controlling society. And so you begin to have the invention of writing and the invention of records. The invention of writing is very important because, for example, when you're exchanging things, it's rather nice to know that, you can record that I gave one bale of cloth for getting 3 pots of rice from X. I so-and-so gave a bale of cloth to so-and-so for 3 pots of rice in exchange. This is a transaction. It's a social and economic transaction which is recorded. So the early records are records of these kinds of transactions. I mean, you have potsherds all over South India coming into the island of Socotra, which has many inscriptions, where you have inscribed the names of people. And obviously the potsherds were belonging to a pot which contained things, items, which that person owned and gave in exchange. So in Prakrit, you have the names of people on these potsherds, which is the beginnings of writing, and it's the beginnings of exchange. Society then is divided into those who control law and order. What are the laws by which exchange is taking place? What is the ordering of the exchange? And those who do the labor that produces the goods that are being exchanged. This is a very clear-cut division. Some people are the laborers who produce the items for exchange. Some people are those who control those items and control either the trade or the donation or whatever it may be. And slowly and gradually, those who are doing the controlling become more powerful and take over the control of society. Now, this is a very crude attempt at trying to explain to you how you begin from nothing and you arrive at the point where there is recorded history, and then you start talking about history. Now, this is the point at which you can ask the question, why was it that victory in terms of the victory in battles and conquests and so on became so important? Why? Because it gave you control over the other person. So this is an important issue. The kind of control it gave you was the control that led you to oversee what the other person was doing. So it was not just that, you and I are equal and it doesn't really matter whether you have a little more or I have a little more. I am asserting the fact that I have more than you have, and therefore I have a control over you. And this becomes a very important aspect of society, which we today are beginning to challenge a little bit in the kind of history we write, because we are moving away from battles and conquests. We're moving away to looking at what was the nature of society, why was it necessary to have battles and conquests? Why was it necessary for there to be this degree of control? And this is all part of the basic question of history for peace. Are we really looking for a history that deals not with violence and control through power using violence, but deals with relationships, human relationships that are equal relationships or are relationships that have a different meaning, which are not necessarily controlled, but which are necessarily there as relationships? Now, I mentioned earlier on that society gets divided into groups of different kinds. And what are these groups that society gets divided into when we come to the point when there is history and there's production and there are objects and there's a different kind of functioning from the early hunter-gatherers and the early cultivators and so on? First of all, there is the division into the clan. How do I identify myself? I'm part of a big group of human beings, men, women, and children moving together, collecting food, hunting animals, and there's another group moving together. How do I know which group I belong to? Identity is very fundamental to all kinds of historical dividing up. So the first identity is the identity of which social group do I belong to? And it begins with the family. Who are my parents? Who are my siblings? This is very important. You begin to count others as being more distant. Your closer relationships and identity are with parents and siblings. If you're recording who your parents are and your siblings are, and you're recording them not just for your generation, but you're recording them for posterity, so that 4 generations down, your great-great-grandchild will know who its great-great-grandfather and grandmother were. We call that a lineage, and we call it a genealogy, which records the relationship between people and their children, their grandchildren, their great-grandchildren, and as they go down the scale to more and more. Now, clans and tribes are very often a collection of clans. They can be. These are all identifiers, and they can be either a single tribe or they can be a collection. If you read the Mahabharata, for example, Krishna belongs to the Vrishni clans, the Vrishni tribes that are multiple. And whenever there is a crisis and there's a need for discussion, the Vrishnis collect, they assemble. And it is the elders of these families that get together and assemble and take decisions. And this is terribly important, the assembling of the elders taking decisions. This is prior to kingship. We haven't got to kings yet. This is simply tribal assemblies. Similarly with the Bharatas, they're clans that gather together into tribes and they have their assemblies. Gradually, a particular group of families or a family within this collection becomes a little more powerful. And as its power increases and it gathers more people into its control and identifies them with itself, there is slowly the emergence of kingship. So we generally find that societies do begin as tribal assemblies, the Ganarajya and the Ganasangha, which then finally moves into kingship. Why does this happen? Partly, yes, it is the ambition of a particular family to be more powerful than the others. And this is, again, you might call this history for peace, in the sense that ambition is not the same as violence, except when ambition is articulated through violence. That is, you wish to overcome the other family that is competing with you. How do you overcome it? You either turn around to them and say, oh, you're no good, and, I'll take control over your functions and all the rest of it. Or you go and bash them and weaken them. And once you do that, you've introduced violence into your relationship. And history is no longer history for peace. It now becomes the kind of history that we are teaching each other, which is a history in which violence is regarded as perfectly normal. But with all of this, we then have to also look at the social structure. If you're dividing society into groups, and if you're naming the groups and saying these are families that are related, then you have to go into things like endogamy. These are families that can marry into each other. and exogamy. These are families that cannot marry into each other. So you have rules about that. Patriarchy, these are families in which the male line is dominant and controls the functioning of society, and matrilineal is where the female line is dominant. Now, these are all variations, and some variations relate to societies and continue for a long time. Others relate to periods of history. They come in, they go out, they change, they get matrilineal is overpowered by patriarchy. Endogamy is overpowered by exogamy. As the case may be, the thing changes. And it is in India, it is in this process of change, of identity and change, that you get the beginnings of caste. Now, caste is generally treated as drawing on two kinds of stratification, two ways in which society is divided horizontally and vertically: jati and varna. Jati stratification is really quite simple. First of all, it is based on birth. You're born into a jati. You cannot be recruited into a jati. Your identity is by birth, and this is an identity you can never change, technically, theoretically, though there are instances when people have tried to change this identity, but in fact cannot be changed. And it's very often incorporated into the story of these lineages, the stories of the birth of people going down the generations. And sometimes you fiddle the lineage and you put in an extra one or two people, and sometimes you leave them as they are. But anyway, that is part of jati. Now, because your identity is by birth, your marriage has to follow certain rules. And this is where endogamy and exogamy comes in. Some societies in India were endogamous. They married within a group, and others were exogamous. They insisted on marrying outside that group. Some, as I said, were patriarchal, where the father was dominant, and others were matrilineal. So there are rules of marriage that have to be followed. And those of you that have ever sat with your grandmothers, for example, when marriage proposals have come in for an 18-year-old granddaughter, if you listen to the conversation, it's fascinating because it's all about hierarchy. What is the jati to which the groom belongs? Is that jati higher than our jati to which the bride belongs? Or is it lower? Can we make that concession of marrying down, or must we marry up? Or do we have to find an equal basis? Now, these are very important considerations in the arranging of marriages. We may not think that they're important because we think of marriages, oh yes, somebody comes and proposes somebody's name and they get married. But there's a lot of investigation that goes on behind the scenes as to hierarchy, status, income, wealth, etc., etc. Hierarchy and status are very important. And the third factor, which is important, is occupation, because very often your identity is also what is your occupation. For example, the occupation of the potter is considered low, whereas the occupation of the ivory carver is considered high. Now, what the logic is behind high and low is difficult for us to determine because we don't belong to those societies. Those were societies of long ago. But nevertheless, we have to keep in mind the fact that these are all decisions that have been taken on the basis of some explanation. Whether the explanation makes sense or not is another matter. But each of these decisions is explained. And you have to know what the explanation is. That is jati. The other is varna. Varna is much more a bigger status. There are not multiple varnas, there are only 4. And they're quite clearly indicated by status. In fact, the earliest hymn, which was not so early after all, it was quite a late hymn that was added onto an early text, but nevertheless, that hymn makes it very clear that there is a status difference between the Brahman, the Kshatriya, the Vaishya, and the Shudra, the 4 varnas. If birth is inflexible, varna is supposedly inflexible, but can be fiddled around with a little bit. You remember the famous story of the Maratha leader Shivaji, who was born a Bhonsle, which is not the highest of castes. Very respectable, but not very high. And he gets the Brahmins from Banaras to come and legitimize him as a Kshatriya when he becomes the ruler of the Maratha kingdom. So there's a certain amount of play which is not obvious but can quietly take place in the ranking of status. Now, this is not something unusual for India. In every culture, when you're ranking status, there's always a little play of up and down where you put that status. Whereas jati is inflexible, varna is not so inflexible. Occupation also becomes a very much more important factor in varna than in jati. The functions of the 4 varnas, the 4 status, are very clearly ordered. The Brahman has religion, ritual, the legitimation of upper caste people, and learning and scholarship. That's the Brahman's function. He must know the deities, he must know what the rituals are with the deities, and he must have learning and scholarship at his fingertips. Technically, that's a division. The next is the Kshatriya, kings and royalty. Therefore, invariably, invasion, conquest, victory, doing down somebody, or raising up somebody, this is all part of the functioning of the Kshatriya. Vaishyas are those that produce wealth. They do it through cultivation and they do it through trade. Very often, traders tend to be of Vaishya status, and landowners where it comes to cultivation. And the Shudras, the 4th category, are the ones that technically provide the labor. They're the ones in all these categories who are at the level of providing labor. Caste, however, at a certain point, gets split. And this is not at the earliest point, it's sort of in roughly at the time when the Dharma Shastras were written, which is the early centuries AD. And it gets split into 2 categories. The Savarna, which is the Varnas that are in touch, the people who are in touch with the Varnas, who have a Varna status and can claim it, and the Avarna, which are those who have no Varna status and cannot claim it. So, your upper castes, your 4 castes are Savarnas, and your outcasts and your untouchables are all Avarna. So this is a split in society. It's a split in the hierarchy, and the split is controlled by social equality. Those that are in the upper grades are relatively more equal to each other. Those that are in this second lower grade are absolutely unequal with the upper grade. The Savarna has Varna status, the Avarna does not have Varna status, and is therefore very often described as impure. Why were there castes and who worked these castes? Who controlled them? Clearly, the control was in the hands of the highest caste. And so you very often have references to societies divided into Brahmins and non-Brahmins. The non-Brahmin is this large category of people who are not specified, or other people have different kinds of views on this. It's interesting with the sources, because the written sources are the sources that were written by the Brahmins. We get much more information about Brahmin society from the written sources. They're writing about their own social groups than we do about those that didn't have a Varna collection, the Avarnas. They were considered too low, too impure, too untouchable. The Brahmins were not concerned with them, so we know very, very little about them. The only way we can know something about this underdog of society is perhaps through archaeology, because archaeology gives you a cross-section, as it were, of society. A good site, when it's cut down, will give you a cross-section of society. And sometimes you do get that section of society which is all the way down. And so these records are maintained by Brahmins, and later on they're maintained by traders. Remember, the traders are very important because they're the ones who have to learn to write and have to learn mathematics to keep their records. And that's the point, that the traders then are keeping records and using a language, a written language. To that extent, they are similar to the Brahmins, except that the Brahmins are using religious records which are of a different order. Nevertheless, there is a certain similarity, as it were, between, at some levels, the work that is being done by traders and the work that is being done by Brahmins. Now, when you're keeping records, the important thing is to determine which record, whose records are you keeping? I can get up and say that, my records are very important. And the next person may turn around and say, oh, rubbish, you belong to the wrong caste. My records are more important. So there has to be somebody who's keeping an eye on who is keeping records. This was both the Brahmins and the traders. They're the two people who are keeping records. You're keeping records and you're also writing in favor of certain groups. For example, the Kshatriyas. They're probably the most favored group in the sense that everybody is writing poems and biographies and lengthy descriptions of the families and the family life and the actions and the activities and the events connected with the Kshatriyas. They are the kings, after all. They're the rulers, or they are attached to rulers. And they're the ones who are really keeping up the levels of what is being recorded. So work in praise of kingship and conquest, like the epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, are both texts that are essentially of a Kshatriya ethos, and they are keeping the records of the events of those who are Kshatriyas. The view, therefore, is the view of battles and conquests and invasions and so on, but the view can change a little bit in favor of other activities as well. And the end of the story, in a way, is that when you're finished with keeping the records of this, that, and the other, you come to knowing whose records are important and keeping those. And so if you want If we want to study less of war and more of peace, then we really have to go to the philosophical records and less to the records of the Kshatriya activities, which were largely invasions and battles. So we have to choose the study of what aspects of society we regard as being really useful and really important and much more peaceful as well. I mean, unfortunately, we've all been brought up on a history that is full of nothing but battles and wars. How this happened, one doesn't know, but it's something that goes across the world. Everybody who studies history is studying the battles and invasions and violence that took place in their own society. And it's only now, in the last 50 years, that historians have said, enough of that, let's look at other activities. And there is now an attempt to try and balance the invasions and the battles with peaceful activities so that there is some kind of equilibrium. That is, you study now the socioeconomic background of societies and see where there were peaceful settlements of problems and of tensions and so on. Settlements that did not cause a breakage of peace. That's the important criteria. These were all settlements that were peaceful. And looking at these aspects of the past can bring in a different set of values. The alternatives that could have happened without violence are stressing a different kind of lifestyle and a different kind of value system. And that would certainly be better for purposes of peace. And the historical method, then, the historical inquiry, which is not just to find out about what invasions took place, but to find out really about what treaties took place. How did people come together? How did people learn to live together, even in situations where there seemed to be a lot of, as it were, hidden aggression? Now, all of this becomes possible only if we do some critical thinking about history. And how do we do this? We have to make sure that the knowledge about the past is completely open, that we consider every aspect of the past and not just what the elite or the rulers did and the events connected with their lives. Knowledge has to be open, the boundaries of knowledge have to be open, and it is important to know what kind of different questions do we ask. We are no longer asking, when did they reign, and who did they invade, and what battles did they fight, and how much territory did they control? No, we ask a different set of questions. We work out a different set of questions. And keeping in mind the fact that a broad understanding of the past that covers these aspects, the other questions, gives us a better knowledge and understanding of what we have inherited from the past, because the battles and invasions we do not inherit. We inherited the other things. And also how best we can use that inheritance to make the present even better than the past. That's all I have to say.
Thank you, Romila. This was as expected. Absolutely very, very insightful. And I will hand over to Mayuki we see one person has a question, and I'm sure there will be more coming up. But Mayuki, do you want to take over? Moderate. Hi.
I'll just take the questions that Mrs. Biswas has for us in the chat, but I would request everyone else to put their questions and then we can go over them. So Mrs. Biswas asks, history is full of violence, which was considered the order of the day. What lesson can we learn from that when we explore history for peace? And the second question that she has is, how do we reconcile attempts to erase contested histories with history for peace?
Do you want me to answer these?
Yes, these are the questions we have. Would you like me to go over a few more, and then would you like to take those questions together?
As you like. I'm in your hands.
There's one more question. If you could add this, then take another set. So the other question that we have is, how can we teach British rule over India with a focus on peace?
Okay. British rule. And the first two,
First one looked at how can we, if violence is the order of day in history, what do we learn from that when we explore history for peace?
okay.
Second one is, how do we reconcile contested histories, which there's an attempt to erase them, with history for peace?
All right. British rule. Well, one of the ways of doing it is to state quite openly that colonialism was not a peaceful movement by any means. Written into colonialism was a great deal of violence. So, was it purely violence or something else? And you look at the something else. What else did it give us? It did give us a certain, it gave us a certain amount of new technology, which we would have anyway had to have. Had we not gone through the process of colonialism, we would have had to beg, borrow, or steal this new technology from whoever had it and bring it into our system of working. So that was one thing that one could focus on. Having said that there was a certain amount of violence, instead of going on and on reiterating that violence, it would be quite useful to say, right, but it also brought us whatever it brought us: steam engines for railways, motor cars, a certain kind of education. Was this a good education or a bad education? That's a very fundamental question that people don't ask because they're all busy talking about other things. Food habits, clothing, effect on daily life. You know, that side of being alive and being a member of society, which is important and which gives another dimension altogether to the way we live. And this is something that we have to consider as the other side of colonialism. And it's not just we who have to consider it. In fact, the entire southern hemisphere of the world has to consider it, because remember that colonialism existed right across the universe, from Latin America to Africa to Southern Asia and on. So these are issues that are important. And one of the important aspects of this, now that this question has been raised, is there are some people who are thinking and writing about what they call comparative colonialism. That is, you have British colonialism, you had French colonialism, you had Spanish. The whole of Latin America was Spanish and Portuguese. What was the difference between them? Was there a difference? What was the aim of each one of these? I mean, the French, for example, talk about the civilizing mission, none of which they did, but nevertheless, that was the ideal. We're bringing civilization to these areas. What do you mean by civilization? What are you actually bringing to these areas? These are fundamental questions that we do not ask. We put them aside. We don't discuss them. And yet it's terribly important to go into details about what exactly do we mean when we say this is a civilization? It's not just having big monuments and having good literature and having art and painting and so on. There must be something more. What is that more? We have to discover that. So it's a question of how you look at this side of colonialism as well as the side that we have already looked at. This is not to say that the violence should be forgotten, but this is to say that the violence should be also seen together with other non-violent inputs. And then you discuss whether the end result was positive or negative. You don't base it on just one issue. Is violence the order of the day? Well, I mean, you have to really begin by saying violence should not be the order of the day. Why should it be? Why do we happily accept violence as the order of the day? You take present-day life, for example. Since 1947, there's been nothing but violence here and violence there. And surely there are ways of stopping that by giving the kind of education and values to people that go on saying you cannot solve a problem through violent means. You have to be thinking about these problems and you have to give more thought. And we should actually, in schools and colleges, be thinking precisely about the counter to violence. That's not what we're doing. We're accepting, if you pick up a NCERT textbook today, it's accepted the violence. It's praising the violence. Great kings and great conquerors. I mean, that's the first thing you have to question. Great kings are not great conquerors. Great kings are also people who do other things. What are these other things they're doing? You don't talk about them, but you should begin to talk about them. It is absolutely essential. In other words, what I'm trying to suggest is that we have willfully accepted violence as the criteria of an advanced society. But should we not stop it? Should we not say no? I mean, what is it doing? Look at Gaza and Israel and what's happening today. Where is it taking us? Is this the sign of an advanced society? I don't regard it as that. But there are other people who do. But these are issues that we should be shouting and screaming about and saying, these are worth arguing about. The value system that we need to have is a system that we should constantly be arguing and debating about and making sure that we have the right value system. You can't go on saying, oh, yes, we're for peace, but go and shoot that person and go and shoot that person and go and drop a bomb here and drop a bomb there. That's not the way it works. It has to be a very conscious decision. Contested histories. Very often, it's not the history that's contested, but it's people who want to make a contest and they use history. You know, it's how do I make my point? By arguing that this, what we've been told so far, is not correct. Okay, it may not be correct. Now, the whole point about debating history, if it's a contested history and you're debating it, you have to use what many of us call the historical method in what you are saying as part of the contest. What is the historical method? Are you sure that the evidence that you're using to make your point, first of all, are you using evidence? Or are you just making up a fancy situation and taking people to war on that? Are you sure that the evidence that you're using is reliable? Has it been proven? Or is it WhatsApp news and the social media who's telling you this, that, and the other, and you pick it up and say, yes, this is evidence. This is not evidence. This is nonsense. So you have to have reliable evidence. you have to then say, what is the meaning of this evidence? What are the causal connections? If this evidence is reliable, did it really cause this particular attack, invasion, conquest, act of violence, or did it not? You have to prove that as a second issue. And thirdly, your explanation. Why did something happen? Was it simply because King X said, I want to attack King Y, and he got up and attacked King Y? Or were they legitimate reasons? And have you got evidence for those reasons? Now, there's actually a lot that has to be said and discussed when there are contested histories. It's not just my version and your version. You have to prove the version. And this is becoming more and more important now, with historians saying, what is your evidence? Which was not said before.
Thank you so much. In the interest of time, I'll club a couple of questions which are similar. So we have a question which is asking that when we read history, there are two main trends vis-a-vis wars and violence on the one hand and trade on the other. The two are inherently contradictory. Is there any recorded history capturing the schisms between the two? On similar lines, we have questions which are asking on about justice through teaching history for peace. And lastly, there's a question which is dealing more with the present than the past, which is asking about how one goes about teaching history for peace, not because of the violence of the past, but a present trend to glorify persons and vilify others, making special reference to the vilification of the Mughals and the as villains who've hurt Hindu society, whereas a Shivaji or a Rana Pratap become Hindu heroes.
Yeah. I don't think trade and warfare are necessarily contradictory. I think it's perfectly possible to have extensive trade and not have warfare. It becomes a cause of warfare. Trade becomes a cause of warfare if it's unequal, completely unequal. If there's an excessive amount of profit on one side and debit on the other, then sometimes the answer is not to say, well, we'll do away with the trade, but we'll go to war over this trade. It is unnecessary. It's not something that we should assume that wherever there is trade, there's bound to be war. That is not an assumption that I would accept. I mean, trade can lead to war, but it can also lead to perfectly happy situations. I mean, when you consider, for example, that if you take Indian history, the whole of the West Coast from Gujarat to Kerala was settled by Arabs, whom the Sanskrit sources refer to as the Yavanas. They weren't Greeks, they were Arabs, but nevertheless. And this was not done through the Arabs attacking the trading centers of the West Coast. It was done through trading and settlements. As earlier you had what was sometimes called the Indo-Roman trade, where the Eastern Mediterranean and the Red Sea traders come to the settlements on the West Coast in India and stay there. They have to stay there for a certain period of time till the winds change and the ships can go back. And then some of them set up permanent settlements. And we find Roman and Greek objects along the West Coast at various sites and so on. So they obviously were settled there for a bit. So there are periods and areas where the trading is it has nothing to do with violence. It is, in fact, entirely an economic activity, and it needn't be tied up with that kind of thing. And yes, when it is tied up with violence, then it is for the historian to explain why the violence was necessary. And very often, in fact, the violence was not necessary. It was simply that there has been such a glorification of violence in our culture that violence comes to be associated with success. And therefore, if you want to lord it over another trading group, you turn violent, and you do it in that way. There's a lot, I must say, that I think that if the curriculum of history was to be changed, as you mentioned, as this question mentioned, there would be much more peace in the country than there is at the moment with this absolutely exaggerated curriculum. Justice through teaching history is very important. And how many people take up these issues? They tend not to, because then they just turn around and say, oh, this is a matter of the law. It's got nothing to do with history. But in fact, it has to do with history. It's something that happened in the past and happened importantly in the past. And therefore, you have to go into the question of why it happened, who caused it, who said that the solution was to be a violent solution? Why didn't they sit down and draw up a peace treaty and proceed to go to a peaceful solution of whatever it was that they were fighting over? So there again, it's a question of where the emphasis is being placed in teaching what the society was doing at that time. The present violence. Yeah, it's very much a case of, I'm afraid it's not history that's producing the violence. It's the violent use of history. There's a difference between knowing history, understanding history, and exploiting an idea of history for a political purpose. And what is being done today is that the idea of the Mughals as historical ancestors is being exploited for a political purpose. There's absolutely no need to throw out Mughal history, because at some point, your great-grandchild will say, why are we not taught Mughal history? What happened in all these years? And they'll see the remains of the Taj and say, what was this monument? By denying the veracity of history today, we all know now that history is not just the story of violence. We know that it's got a lot more to it. If you don't explain to your students what more is there and what are the other aspects of the past that history is concerned with, you will end up with students thinking that the only thing that happened in the past was violence, that all you had was this. You have to explain that there was a lot else, and violence was just one small part. And therefore, today, violence should not be the solution. We cannot bring history into our present-day political problems. If you have a political problem with a particular community, you solve it on the basis of what the relationship is today. You don't take it back into the past. By taking it back into the past, you are, in fact, you're denigrating the discipline of history. History is not meant for that purpose. History is not meant to provide you with political ammunition for the present. It's meant to explain what the past was.
Thank you, Professor Thapar. A couple of other questions. The first one is a practical question. This is a drama teacher. So she's a teacher of both drama and history to young people at an international school. Uh, she writes, I tend to make my lessons practical reenactments of major historical events. We have been on a salt march, enjoyed a Victorian dinner party, and become suffragettes and policemen. Can you suggest any other exciting scenes from the Mughal period that we can enact and empathize with? A second question deals with how imagination and possibilities can help in writing history for peace. And a third looks at how the impact it would have if one leaves out the history of invasions and focuses only on philosophical aspects, and asks if it would not affect the learning of history in its totality.
Yeah, well, the last question is the one that many people ask. No, the purpose of doing history is not to leave out invasions and battles. It is simply to say that this was only one small part of the totality of people's lives. And that if there were invasions and battles, as indeed there was a lot more which had to do with other aspects of life and which was more important. It's a question of where you're putting the importance. Are you putting it on invasions and battles, or are you putting it on civil society, on the economy, on technology, on religion, on philosophy, and so on? Now, if you're creating thinking human beings, you have to have the other side. You cannot do without it. It's got to be there. You have to know something about that side. And invasions and battles and things are marginally important in a system such as that. If you're understanding the totality of a society, you don't give so much emphasis to invasions. It's a question of the degree of emphasis that you give to different aspects of society. Imagination, yes, but be sure not to say that this is actually how it happened, because otherwise you can imagine all kinds of scenes which are totally unrealistic. And in a sense, what we are arguing at the moment as professional historians is precisely to say that the imagination that goes into the setting up of the so-called history of India as given in certain texts and certain ideas and so on, Hindutva history, for example, this is imagination. This is not history. It doesn't observe the rules of history writing as I defined them a little earlier, the whole question of reliability of evidence, the use of evidence, all of that, the logic of evidence, and how the explanation has to be rational and so on. You can't do that with imagination. You can imagine some of the values. I mean, I can give you an example of, for example, the biography of Gulbadan Begum, which is based on her own life history as she's written it. You can pick that up and say, I'm doing an imaginative performance of this text, but emphasize the word that you're doing an imaginative performance. Don't say that my performance of this text is exactly as it happened at that time. That's where the problem comes in. You cannot repeat something that happened in the past. And so you cannot repeat history. Whatever you're saying, in fact, whatever you're writing and explaining, has an element of the imagination in it. Because you weren't there, you didn't see it, you're not a witness. You're reconstructing from the evidence that you got. To that extent, you're a lawyer, but you're not a witness. And so that's something you have to be careful about. And the same thing when you reenact. Be sure that what you're reenacting is made clear to your audience that this need not be the reality. It's what you as an individual think was the reality at that time. It's very important to make that point. Otherwise, I mean, you get film after film made on historical themes, some of which are absolute nonsense.
Thank you, Professor Thapar. We have a rather long question, which is looking at how can we effectively educate students about the implicit systemic violence perpetuated due to the caste system? Additionally, how do we address uncomfortable aspects of the past in the classroom, such as D.N. Jha's work on the scared animal, your research on Somnath, implicit systemic violence perpetuated by Brahminical patriarchy as conceptualized by Uma Chakravarti, etc.
Well, I think that you have to bring in the element of, questioning. That is important. That whatever you're taught, however well you're taught it, and however convincingly you're taught it, don't forget that there is always a question at the base of your mind. And don't hesitate to ask that question, because very often, by asking the question, you get a clarification. It's not always that you ask a question and it goes off in the wrong direction or anything of that kind. Questions are often clarifications in answering questions. So don't worry about that. You do ask your questions and seek clarifications, because that is really very important. And keep in mind the fact that all knowledge is subject to questions. This is not just a certain kind of history. All knowledge, even scientific knowledge, which is supposedly fairly foolproof, is nevertheless questioned. That's how you get an advance in knowledge. You question it, and out of all those 3 or 4 questions, maybe one question makes sense and gives you something which is an advance in knowledge. So questioning is not to be thrown aside, but reenactment, yes. Imagination, yes. And, trying to understand the question in a larger context. A question is asked with reference to a particular event. You answer it with reference to that event, but that event is taking place in a bigger context. So you bring the context in and say that this is how the event happened. And that context becomes very important.
Thank you, Professor Thapar. Quite a few teachers have asked if you could recommend resources that would help them teach histories for peace, new histories that are moving away from battles. And one teacher, in fact, has specifically asked if you could provide an example from Indian history where peaceful resolution was achieved despite significant cultural or religious differences.
Where what was achieved?
Peaceful resolution.
Peaceful resolution. Okay, I'll give it some thought. I don't think I would respond off the top like this, but I'll give it some thought, and I'll write down 2, 3, 4 books that people can read. But I'm glad these questions were asked. I thought they were extremely good questions. Thank you.
I have only the teachers who are present here to thank. I'll hand over to Megha.
Thank you, Mayuki, and thank you, Professor Thapar. There's one. We want to go into this. There's a last one question that has again come. Well, there are 2 specific ones. If you want to take those, Mayuki. There's one teacher who's asking, could you share a few insights on your research on Somnath? And the other one is, how should we teach the dictated piece of the Versailles Treaty?
How should we teach?
The dictated peace, Versailles Treaty. I think maybe if we take the other one first, could you share a few insights on your research on Somnath?
Well, the Somnath book actually, it started with, let me give you the background because that might make it a little clearer. It started with the fact that we were holding a seminar for one of my colleagues who was retiring on sacred geography. And sacred geography meaning that all these sites that had temples, mosques, gurdwaras, whatever, sacred structures. And as you know, people who specialize in religion often have their pet sites of sacred geography. And so most of the people present at that event had their pet sites. And I didn't. I am not a specialist in religion, so I didn't have a site that I would always go to. And I was sitting there and holding my head and saying, now, what do I do? How do I sort of get into this seminar without... And then it struck me, well, why don't I look at a sacred site that has undergone historical change? That from becoming the sacred site in one religion, it was destroyed and then it underwent changes and so on. And so Somnath came to mind as a major sacred site that had been raided and had undergone change. And so I started doing my research on Somnath. And two things happened. One was that I discovered that there are many sources in Sanskrit which people have not used. The attitude was that, oh, the Somnath event takes place in 1026, that's the 11th century, and there are Persian sources on this. Therefore, it's the beginning of the Muslim period, and we will only use Persian sources. So you get book after book written on Somnath using only the Persian sources. And I come along and say, I can't read Persian, but I can read Sanskrit, and I will look at the Sanskrit sources. And I find, to my great surprise, that wherever Somnath is mentioned, and it's mentioned very infrequently, there is no mention of Mahmud's raid, except on one occasion when it's mentioned in passing that Mahmud came and raided many places, and then there's a list of places amongst which is Somnath. So I thought this was very strange, because after all, if the raid was that dramatic and eventful, surely those who'd suffered because of the raid would write about it in their texts. But there it was. And the interesting thing was that the Jain texts in Sanskrit have the maximum amount of write-up on Somnath, not the Brahman texts, the Jain texts. And the maximum amount of write-up in the Jain texts is that the king was told to build a temple on the site of the old Somnath temple, which he then proceeded to do, and there's a long description of that, and the condition it was in. And the condition it was in was that it was dilapidated because of two things. It was not maintained by the ministers, so it fell into dilapidation. Two, it was too close to the sea, and the temple is on the seashore. It was too close to the sea, and the sea kept hitting against the temple, and the sea waves destroyed the temple, destroyed the outer walls of the temple. And I thought this was very, very curious that the Jain text, whom you would think would wax eloquent on the violence that had been conducted at Somnath, were talking about two totally non-violent reasons for the dilapidated state of the temple. So then I went to the Persian sources, and I took the help of one of my colleagues, who's a very, very fine Persian scholar, and we sat and read those texts one by one. And I realized that every one of those texts had a different story about what had happened at Somnath. One had the story that the Somnath temple was dedicated to a goddess who was the goddess in Mecca, and she was a pre-Islamic goddess, and she was thrown out of Mecca, and she was brought to Gujarat. And this temple was dedicated to this goddess. Now, there's no element of this in the Somnath temple. Anyway, another text said that it was a Shaiva temple, and that there was an iron pillar hanging from the ceiling, which acted, an iron magnet hanging from the ceiling, which acted as a magnet, and all the statues that were made of metal were all drawn together by this magnet. Someone else had another story about a princess coming from Persia and bringing all kinds of things, including birds who spoke and so on, and leaving them at the Somnath temple. But each of those texts had a different story. So I thought to myself, this is really complicated. This is not easy. There are all these stories. I have to explain why there were these different stories. I have to explain why there is no reference to Mahmud attacking the Somnath temple in the Sanskrit sources. And then when I went to the inscriptions, largely in Sanskrit, what do I find? That the Somnath temple has become a major center of trade in the centuries after Mahmud of Ghazni. It's become a major center of trade. It owns lands. It has all kinds of properties. It has a council, a committee that is looking after the temple, and so on. And there is a Persian sea captain who comes and asks for a plot of land for building a mosque. And the temple and the authorities that are associated with the other temples in the area, the other places in the area, give him a plot of land, and they describe it as a dharma sthana. And they allow him to build a mosque on this plot of land. And the story goes on like that, until you come to the British. And it is in the colonial records that this story that we're familiar with, that Mahmud came and destroyed the temple of Somnath, and he killed all these people, etc., 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 and built a bit of a mosque over there with a dome on it and all, which he actually did at one point. That all comes out of the British records. It's not there before, none of the... So obviously my question as a historian was, how do you get these completely different versions? What a colleague of mine called the Rashomon story, that every version is different. How do you get these different versions? How do you explain the need for these different versions that change over time until you get the British version, which is the one that we all grew up knowing as children in school? And this I found absolutely fascinating. Then I turned to the oral tradition, and that's even more interesting because it talks about a nephew that Mahmud had, and Mahmud, we know, had no nephews at all. This was all make-believe. A nephew that Mahmud had who saves the cows from slaughter by a Hindu ruler. And you read these things and you say, my God, I mean, am I going nuts, or is this story being told by people who really are telling all kinds of different stories. Why are they telling these different stories about this particular site? That became my basic question. That is a question I tried to answer in this book that I wrote.
What an appropriate way to end a session on exploring can we teach history for kids. Thank you. That was really wonderful. Thank you so much. And
Thank you.
please go ahead. You were saying something.
No, nothing.
Okay.
I was just saying thank you.
Okay. This was wonderful, absolutely. And it's thank you all for being here, and we will see you soon again. There's a question, there are lots of messages coming of thank you. Thank you, Professor Thapar. You have given a fresh perspective by highlighting the value of questioning. It was a pleasure and honor to listen to you. Savita Gautam says, beautifully explained. Thank you so much, Romila, ma'am. Very well explained, says Chaya. Thank you, ma'am. And thank you. Madhurima, profoundly. Madhurima says, thank you profoundly, Professor. And they're carrying on. Ranjana says, I will share Somnath's story with my class 6 students.
Good.
Wonderful. Yes. I think now we should let you go. We've taken up much longer of your time than
Well,
I would have inflicted you with. Thank you.
okay. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye.